The Rundown, Part 26, by John Miro.
Twilight fell upon the darkening road. I found myself again alone. Street lights went out by one, by two, by three. Now reveled in the shadows that had grown. Yes, I reveled in the darkness I had known.
Nicodemus's eyes were struggling in the dim light thrown by the nearly exhausted glow paint, but the tunnel, though musty, was otherwise in good repair. The passageways seemed to stretch on forever, though, until suddenly he heard a low thrum from somewhere ahead. The scent of decay in the tunnel began to mingle with something newer, harsher, something he couldn't place, but it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "All right, look sharp. The tunnel exit's just up. Crory!" Spillane shouldered roughly past Nicodemus and Tyson, a blur in the shadows, until he reached and knelt over a prone shape on the ground. Spillane's reaction jarred Nicodemus into high alert. He hugged the side of the tunnel, looking forward and back for signs of threat. "I know that smell," he heard Tyson say. The words were followed by a scraping sound, and he just barely saw Tyson's outline hold up a small canister. "Tumbler nerve agent," he said, Tyson's voice betraying his disgust. "Crory!" Spillane shook the form on the ground, but its tentacles dragged, limp and lifeless. Dim, scarred glow paint outlined a door to the right of the body. Through it, Nicodemus could hear the thrumming. Now he could tell it was the klaxon of a launch countdown. "The Orion!" Tyson bounded for the door, having had the same thought, thumped against its surface, looking for the mechanism to open it. "Usher, help me!" He stopped wasting words. Nicodemus was already in position beside him, grunting with effort. Together they dragged the rusting, squealing door open. The Orion's airlock was only paces away from the hidden mouth of the access tunnel. The airlock was locked down. Pre-flight warning lights were strobing. They were too late. Nicodemus thought of one last thing that just might work. "Warning," crowed an automated voice. "Orion launch countdown has begun. Please step away from the airlock." Nick closed his eyes and made peace with what he was about to do. He punched his passcode into the door. "Police override denied," bellowed speakers throughout the wall. "Orion airlock has been retracted." "No, no, no!" Nick screamed and slammed his fist into the panel hard enough to make the holographic lettering on the wall flicker. Now the PD knew he had somehow gotten inside a secure area without proper clearance. There would be hard questions ahead. And Bird was still getting away. Spillane had gotten them up through the bowels of the pier to the final door that stood between him and Roland Bird, only seconds too late. "How do we open it?" Tyson shouted over the alarm klaxon. "Spillane, help us!" Usher screamed, looking over his shoulder to the hidden passage on the opposite wall. "Hold on, Crory!" the Skanen screamed, ignoring Usher. Spillane had pushed his arms up to his shoulders through his friend's coral-like exoskeleton as he administered compressions to Crory's circulatory muscles. The shriveling, oozing body of Spillane's tumbler friend lay half in, half out of the hidden passage. He didn't move. He would never move again. Tyson ran to his side and pulled Spillane's hands out, shaking them in front of their owner's eyes. A thick, dark liquid flecked the Skanen's face. "That's death hormone he's sweating," the guard officer roared, his face red, body shaking. "He's already dead. Now help us open that door and catch his killer." Spillane tossed Tyson back with a roar and clacked his mandibles together so hard Usher saw the chitinous tips crack. He laid his hands on one of Crory's limp tentacles, uttered something softly in Skanen, then ran across the hall with a roar. Tyson leaped out of the way as Spillane slammed into the door at top speed, hammering his topmost hands into the seal running down the center of the airlock. The alloy buckled beneath his claws. Usher's eyes widened, and he pushed Tyson back around Spillane. "Grab a hold as tight as you can." He turned and reached for the bar vertically inset in the wall on the left of the door, squeezing his knuckles and bracing his feet. He hoped Tyson did the same, but couldn't see him through Spillane, who was hammering at the dented metal seam where the two halves of the door met. Nick saw the door part, and his ears popped as the slightly under-pressure atmosphere of Castis sucked greedily. Spillane clamped his claws through the small crack and pushed. The klaxon came back in full force as the space between inched wider and wider. Usher's clothes whipped around in the sudden gale-force winds, but he forced his watering eyes open to stare through the airlock as Spillane pushed the door almost fully apart. Yellow light strobed, and the Orion's airlock was only inches away. He reached down to the thick belt he wore and slipped a heavy disc loose. A spool on the belt beside the holster for the disc vibrated through his body as the thin lines spun out. Tyson was ahead of him. Nick barely heard the man shout over the screaming wind as he thrust his hand forward. They each slammed matching discs onto the frame running around the airlock, and the red rings around the tops of both devices turned green when they turned the bars set on the tops 90 degrees to the right. Spillane's left mid-arm dug painfully into Nick's side and held him fast as he reached out and grabbed onto a matching vertical handle on the side of Orion. Then Spillane was pushing him through. Nick felt the line from the magnetic anchor spool back in, and he slammed his right hand down to lock the line fast, holding him close to the door. He was dimly aware of Tyson doing the same on Spillane's other side, but his trembling right hand was too busy slamming his police override code into the airlock to pay any more attention. 100 kilometers, Spillane roared over the wind as Nick finished pounding his code into the airlock control. A ship will meet you as soon as you clear airlock space. Nick nodded, wagging his chin far faster than he meant to as his fear bled out. The ship's side airlock hissed open. A gust of wind body-slammed Nick against the doorframe. Pain flared his back, and stupidly he looked down and saw the clouds of Casti swirling far below. He flailed with his hand for the inside of the airlock. Instead, he found Tyson's hand and held on tight while the man pulled him into safety. "Get Bird off that ship!" Spillane roared in the shrinking space between Orion's automatically closing airlock doors. Then the screaming wind was gone. Nick sagged against the doorframe, reaching with trembling fingers to release the spool line attached to his belt, which was locked tight in the polymer seal of the airlock. Tyson lifted him to his feet. Nick stifled a groan. His back screamed, his legs trembled. "Ready," Tyson stage whispered close to his ear. He barely heard it. Nick stood straighter and ignored the pain. He nodded and pulled the thin system guard handgun he'd tucked in the waist belt free at the small of his back. They stepped around a dead crewman lying in a pool of his own blood and began the hunt for Roland Bird. In a Piertown alley, the cellar grating above the basement access of an ancient building swung open, and Martin Lattiser climbed out. He looked casually around as the grating sighed back into place. Satisfied he wasn't being observed, Martin kicked garbage back over the grating and wiggled the fingers of one hand. The sensors woven into the sleeve of his shirt perceived the motion and activated a NewsNet feed on the inside of his ever-present, ever-darkened glasses. A tiny human girl with more white teeth than her mouth could hold smiled out at Martin. "This is Emily Tannis reporting on the border of Metro and so-called Embassy Row. Haven SG's proxy representative, System Guard Consul Gomersall, and our own Councillor Creed join me now." Emily moved her hands like a game show hostess to display the massive stone building behind the floating Manta Councillor and the weary-looking consul. "I am standing in front of a private residence Councillor Creed has just donated to our new trade partner of Haven SG. The woman gushed each word enthusiastically. From the way she spoke, Martin would have guessed Emily's daddy had just given her the keys to the pre-Civil War mansion. "This lavish gift has been provided to function as Haven's first official embassy here in Locklaw." Martin winced from the high-pitched tone of this new reporter. He'd almost rather have Jarvey on. At least that one knew how to report the news without making it sound like a school children's play. Cree seemed to have had enough of the excited young reporter, too, Martin judged, by the way his mouth-grasper swooped in front of her and addressed the camera directly. "I have provided this building to our new trade partner, Haven SG, as a token of respect and friendship between our two peoples. I am very happy to announce that the consul has agreed to forgive our city for letting one of our citizens attempt to murder him, and he is staying on as Locklaw Sky City's first ambassador from Haven SG." Martin stopped walking and stared at the image. Consul Gomersall limped 2 steps forward, his face a mix of humility and pride. As a loyal System Guard citizen
and consul to our friends at Haven, SG. It gives me great pleasure to accept this position. I look forward to getting to know all about you, Locklaw." His eyes flickered off screen before continuing, "And in exchange hope to share with you something of the true nature of Haven and my own beloved system guard. Excuse me, please." He smiled a glittering smile and rushed off screen. Martin flicked 2 fingers to cut off the reporter's vamping to cover for the consul's sudden departure. He idly wondered where the consul had been rushed off to, before gnawing on the larger question. A system guard stooge, recognized as official ambassador on Locklaw's soil? Martin scowled. His boss would be furious. Martin himself didn't care, except for the extra work that would be required. They'd find a way to deal with Gomersall, like every obstacle they'd faced before. He was slightly annoyed his patsy had failed to vaporize the guard dog. Still, he could appreciate the cleverness and ethical gymnastics of Gomersall's move. After barely surviving the attempt on his life he and Underwood had orchestrated, Gomersall had seen and seized a place at Locklaw's political table, not only for Haven, but for the guard as well. "Well, shit," Martin grumbled, stalking back to his personal carrier parked in the shadow of the alley. "That didn't go how we planned it." In his absence, Bennett Underwood's circular penthouse office was silent. The world outside its 360-degree view was tranquil, the skies clear to the city wall on one side and far into the mountains on the other. The room remained silent as the elevator rose out of the floor in the center of the room. The moment the doors cracked open, however, the illusion of peace was shattered. "We solve this now, Bennett," Ada roared at the room's owner, whose body angrily put space between himself and the beautiful woman in the red cloak. "I don't care if the gods of old have rained down on you today. We bury our differences now, or what?" Bennett roared, whirling to face the smaller woman. His eyebrows rose so high ridges of flesh furrowed on his forehead. "You'll whisper some of those secrets you hold over me to the media? That wouldn't bode well for you either." The smaller woman marched right up to Bennett, and the alien inside her leveled its own formidable gaze up at him. "You're selling Locklaw to the guard. Damn right I'll do what I have to stop you." Bennett laughed acidly. "Oh, don't get righteous on me, brother." Ada pushed Jane's hand out, pushing Bennett back a half-dozen steps, and roared, "I am not your brother." Wincing and rubbing his chest with one hand, Bennett scowled. "Was wondering if you'd forgot," he said slyly. One side of his lip curled. "If we're not brothers, then what are we, Ada?" Ada's rage diminished his control of his host's physiology, and Jane's face flared red. He pointed her shaking finger at Bennett. "What happens if Bert is caught on that ship? They could tear down the roadhouse. Who keeps the monsters out of Locklaw then? We had an agreement." Bennett reached inside his jacket and brought out his ever-present leather-bound book. He dug his thumb into the old pages and held it open towards Ada. "Perhaps we revisit that agreement. Or have you not noticed the world is changing?" "I had no choice. The guard is back at our door." Ada surged forward faster than Bennett could react. She grabbed his lapels and whirled him around. He lost his feet, stumbled, and landed hard on his knees. "The guard is here because you brought them here." "I brought them here to control them," he spat. "They've pacified half the system. I brought them here before they invaded to control what happens next." "Control it?" Ada shook him hard enough to rock his head back. "You can't control the guard. We agreed to our roles. Each of us was to point them elsewhere in our own ways when the time came, not bring them here." Bennett tried to tear her fingers away, but couldn't. "We haven't set eyes on each other since the war. We're virtual strangers. Brother, I care about my city too much to trust a stranger." "Your city?" Ada's hate burned out of Jane's eyes. "You don't care about Locklaw, only about yourself." He shook Bennett again. "You gave me your word. Your fingers dip into every business deal, but you never showed up at the roadhouse, so I trusted you. I left you alone, and you worked against me." He shook Bennett a third time, hard enough to make his eyes roll back. "You dare call me a stranger?" "Yes," Bennett laughed. "I called you a stranger." The manic laugh choked off, and he squeezed his eyes shut with a hiss of pain. He reached up towards Ada's hand again, and she knitted her fingers tighter into the fabric of his suit. Bennett did not try to break Ada's grip, though. Instead, he wriggled a small box out of his jacket and twisted it open one-handed with a cracking sound. "You say you're not a brother. You're not a stranger." Ada looked at the box, expecting a weapon, an attack. When he saw what was inside, his eyes widened in horror. "No," he whimpered, and tried to tear his hands away, but now Bennett's hands were wrapped around his wrists. "Not a brother? Not a stranger?" Bennett repeated, and squeezed his grip tighter. "Let's find out which." Ada felt the pain of the thing, jagged and hard, trapped between their flesh. "No," Ada whimpered again, and his stomach dropped at the sound his emotions channeled through his host's voice. He'd never heard what Jane's terror sounded like before. He whipped his hands to break the hold, but Bennett held on just long enough. Ada felt the skin on Jane's face ripple, felt the pain of the old wound, the old shame return, as if it were new. "The scales sure knew their science," Bennett laughed, seeing the despair Ada channeled onto Jane's face. "Even in a new host, they can muck you up." Ada watched drops of blood well up across Bennett's nose and snarled like the trapped animal he was. He launched his knee into that bloody face, and finally the man let go, crumpling dazed to the floor. Ada heard the hard thing skitter across the floor and looked. Saw it. A dragon's claw. Ada reached Jane's trembling fingers to her face. He felt the blood, felt the searing pain of the slashes. "You bastard," Ada muttered and ran for the elevator. "Elevator locked down," Bennett shouted, coughed on blood, and laughed again. The doors closed before Ada made it halfway across the room. He closed his eyes, the heat of his shame burning hotter than the wounds on his host's face. He turned back to Bennett, but couldn't look at what he knew he'd see on that face either. He staggered to the window, looking out across the city he loved, the people he fought for. "So not a stranger after all," Bennett slurred, his voice thick from the pain of his returned injuries and perhaps a broken nose from Ada's own savage attack. "Look, Ada. Look!" Ada couldn't stop himself. He stared at the glass locking him away from the city, stared at 2 long gashes crossing Jane's pretty young face from temple to jaw. One lip ruined. Bennett put his hands on his shoulders. "I told you we were family. You just forgot for a while, brother," Bennett snarled close to Ada's ear. Ada moved his eyes and saw his captor in the window. Saw a clawed and bloodied face just like his own. Bennett took in another breath and said the hateful words Ada knew were coming. "I see you now, Brother Tyr." On board the Orion, Nick and Tyson had silently leapfrogged through the ship, meeting in junctions off the central corridor every 100 feet or so. Ship's manifest listed 2 crewmen. After the corpse in the chamber off the main airlock, that left 1 unaccounted for. There was no other trace of the crew member or bird anywhere along the spine of the ship. Now the bridge was just ahead, and Nick tipped his weapon around the corner of the starboard walkway off of the bridge. Tyson was in place to the port side of the open bridge airlock. Instantly, Nick knew something was wrong. Tyson's face was white, his expression urgent, almost tortured. He held up one hand to keep Nick silence as he approached. As Nick crept close to his side of the airlock, he heard Roland Bird laugh inside. "Guard dogs think they could just point me and shoot me, and I'd kill whoever they told me to," he brayed. "All for the glory of the guard." He laughed again. "Not quite going their way, huh?" Nick looked at Tyson as Bird's words explained the strain written on the cop's expression. They stared at each other, bodies tense, listening hard. "Want to put me on a stage and kill me dead for doing what they trained me to do," Bird growled. "Blaming me for killing their own. Poor babies crying about their weapon deciding where to shoot itself at." The full meaning of Bird's words dawned on Nick. Bird was a manufactured terrorist, a propaganda weapon minted by the Guard itself. It wouldn't be the first time people created a homegrown evil just to give them a license to go clean it up. It also explained why the Guard were so fired up to have Bird back for a public execution with no questions asked. If even a whisper of this got out, it would firm up resistance against the system guard across Farlost. It also clarified Bennett Underwood's role in Bird's arrival and escape. He'd paid a mercenary a fortune to surrender Bird to Locklaw to manipulate the trade negotiations. Suddenly, Consul Gomersal's alliance with Kree made sense. The guard didn't trust Bennett to play their game. He might be dirty, but apparently he wasn't bought and paid for. By the guard, at least. Nick would have preferred Bennett to be a flunky to the guard. Somehow, the counselor seemed more dangerous for following motives Nick didn't understand. He felt his gun hand squeeze the grips hard and his free hand bunch into a fist. He took a few calming breaths to calm himself. It took more than a few. He wanted the monster dead. But this was bigger now. It wasn't Bird that killed Pesh or Tyzon's brother Salah. It was the guard. Bird's story had to get out. Nick and Tyzon had to get the story out. "How bad does this hurt?" Bird asked, giggling. Nick heard an answering whimper and went cold, realizing there was someone inside the room with Bird. "You should worry about your family, that pretty family of yours." Bird's voice rose to a booming, rage-filled roar suddenly. "And how bad I'll make 'em want to die if you don't plot me a course right into Bennett Underwood right now!" Nick closed his eyes and resisted the urge to laugh hysterically. Of course the terrorist was going to splash the ship down on Locklaw. This wasn't enough of a cluster bomb without hundreds or thousands of civilian casualties. Nick looked at Tyzon. Tyzon looked back, his face twisting in shock that overcame his paralysis. Nick looked a question at Tyzon. Tyzon nodded back and held up 5 fingers. He folded the 5th down, the 4th, the 3rd. Nick nodded along, feeling adrenaline and focus override everything. 2 fingers. 1. A fist. Both men crouched low and stormed the bridge, moving further apart and aiming for Bird's head. Tyzon fired. A thrill of fear made Nick jump. Was he trying to kill him? Did he not understand they needed him alive? Tyzon's shot hit Bird's left arm, blowing several fingers off and eliciting a churning roar. None of that stopped him from reaching out and tugging the man in the chair out and around and slamming him against his chest, clamping the fingers of his one good hand around the man's throat, holding him in front of his own body like a human shield. "Put it down, Bird," Tyzon called out, loudly but still in his eerily calm voice. "Nowhere to go, Roland," Nick tried. "But you come back with us and we'll protect you from the guard. You'll get a fair trial and a chance to tell your side." The old man gasped in pain as Bird's fingers dug into his neck. It would be easy for the powerful Bird to kill the man with a snap or to literally rip the man's throat right out. Roland crouched low behind the man, hissing in pain from his ruined fingers, still splurting blood. He shook his head, tucking his ruined hand against his side to stem the bleeding, and backed away to the port side of the bridge. Nick and Tyzon kept their distance from each other, turning and triangulating on Bird as if they'd worked together for years, not days. "Tell my side?" Bird asked in a quavering, rage-filled voice. "Don't care what you think of my side. And I ain't sitting in anybody's box ever again, not ever again." "Then what?" Tyzon asked, stepping right around the second navigator's chair. "You want us to put you down here?" "Love to." "But then the guard get away with what they did to you," Nick interrupted, fearful of where Tyzon's logic was taking him. Or had they just fallen into good cop, bad cop? If so, Nick was jealous Tyzon got to play bad cop. Good or bad, Nick edged forward, stepping left around the second navigator's chair. There was a body in it, Nick cataloged automatically, an exo with a bloody hole where his face should be. "I'll kill him!" Bird screamed, still backing away. "Then what?" Tyzon urged again. "You kill him, we take you down. Sooner or later, something has to happen." "You're right there." Bird took his hand for the old man's neck and tapped a slate hanging from his belt. Nick realized too late that Bird had been hurting them. A moment later, Bird was firing at them. Not aiming, Nick realized, firing blind. His solid slug weapon roared. Nick hesitated, firing a covering round instead of running. Then Bird was on his knees, still hiding behind the crewman. Waiting for something, Nick realized. Bird had a surprise planned, and his legs were in motion before he understood the nature of the trap. He looked over his shoulder at the corpse of the exo. A red light was blinking fast inside the cavernous hole in its face, and he understood. Then he saw Tyson bolting straight at him, using the navigator's console the Exo's corpse sat in as cover. Nick was already running backwards, hoping that the nav console would provide some cover to him from the explosion that he was sure would happen any moment when Tyson's bulk hit him harder and faster than expected. Suddenly, both men were flying through the air. The explosion knocked the rest of the air out of his lungs and took Nick off his feet. Both men were skidding across the bridge deck when white light and sound overrode all other input. Nick saw triple and heard nothing but a whine like a rocket engine punching out of atmosphere. He felt hands push at his body, and his survival instinct brought him halfway back around again. Blood across his face, Tyson was buckling the mag disc from his own belt onto Nick's. He felt the thing vibrate as it locked fast to the deck plating. Still dazed, Nick wondered why, but had no time to ask when Tyson staggered to his feet, firing back at Bird again. Bird held the ragged, gray-haired corpse of the crewman in front of him still. It had protected him from the explosion he'd planted in the Exo's corpse, and there was enough of it left to protect him from anything but a headshot. Nick watched Tyson shudder and stagger. Blood dripped down his right side from shoulder to thigh. Pieces of silver shrapnel stuck right through the heavy-duty weight belt he wore. He guessed that the guard cop had only been saved from paralysis by that belt, and knew there was no chance Tyson could do precision shooting after that. Hell, Nick didn't know how he was still standing. He looked around for his handgun, but it was gone. He fumbled for the rifle still slung under his jacket, but couldn't coordinate his movements enough to turn over. The mag disc Tyson had secured to the deck plating confounded his messed-up mind. He could do nothing but watch as Tyson staggered forward, bleeding, and then watch as he fell to his knees. Somehow he kept his heavy rifle up, shooting even if the rate was slowing, but he was missing every shot. Bird started laughing. "Piss poor aim, cop." He kept on laughing as Tyson's gun wavered in the air, the man almost too exhausted to hold the weapon up. Bird waved at him with his own gun hand. "I'm over here." Tyson nodded, struggling with his savaged body to fire one last time. That shot went wide too, and Tyson fell to the ground, dropping the rifle and digging his hands into slots in the deck plating. That's when Nick heard the crackling sound. Bird heard it too, and turned in time to see one of the window panes spiderweb from end to end. Then each crack doubled. Then the window exploded. Bird was sucked out in an instant. Nick felt his body spin as the wind tore at him, but Tyson's mag disc held him fast against the deck. Tyson, on the other hand, had been spun around by the wind and now held onto the deck with only one bloody hand. Nick fumbled for the spool for Tyson's mag disc, slamming to release the clamp holding the fine wire inside the spool, and then he was being pulled towards the shattered window too. Nick grappled Tyson around the neck with one elbow, wrapped one leg between the bigger man's tree-trunk thighs, and clamped down tight. His right shoulder popped out of its socket at the impact, but his left arm found a hold, snaking under Tyson's armpit. That left no hand free to lock down the line, and both men bounced and scraped towards the shattered window as the spool played out. With a jolt, they reached the end of the line, and it jerked them short, only their head and shoulders still inside the Orion. The wind hammered them like a giant swatting a bug. Nick was helpless to do more than hold on to Tyson. He screamed in the big man's ear, but there was no need for words. Tyson was already doing what he could, scrambling for a handhold and slowly dragging them back inside against the wind. Nick didn't hear the klaxon, but he saw the strobe of yellow that accompanied it. He looked up in time to see an armor shutter dropping down to seal the bridge. It moved slowly, catching on the frame of the window which had bent outwards from the force of the explosive decompression. Fighting exhaustion and terror, Nick bit into Tyson's jacket for purchase, tightened both legs around the man, and then slapped at the spool controls in blind terror until he felt the vibration of its motor engaging. The little motor slowly dragged both men back inside the bridge. The wind fell to just a fraction of its strength as more of the opening was shuttered. Finally, Nick tugged his legs up out of the way, then risked letting go with his good arm to grab Tyson's under both knees and lift them clear too, just as the shutter dropped down over the shattered window, resealing the bridge. Before the cacophony of the debris battered by the wind died down and the rubble finally settled on the deck, Nick joined Tyson in unconsciousness. There weren't enough drugs. Donald almost would rather be dead than feel what his body had been through, what his soul had been through. Taking revenge on his brother's killer had cost him everything he had left. Inspector Usher moaned beside him, and Tarzan reconsidered. Well, maybe revenge hadn't cost him everything. The elevator doors parted, and he fell onto the deck of the Locklaw PD Pier facility. Usher, of course, fell on top of him, screaming with the pain of his dislocated shoulder and useless arm flopping onto the deck. Tarzan whispered a sheepish apology, got to his feet, and hauled Usher up as well. Both were overloaded with bandages, meds, and wound sealants from the Orion's bridge supply closet. Both had felt pain similar to this in the past, and knowing that it would stop was the only thing that had kept them on their feet. That and the need to reprogram Orion not to crash into Bennett Underwood's penthouse office in Metro Locklaw. Tarzan leaned Usher against the wall. The shoulder pop out again. "No thanks to you," the inspector hissed through gritted teeth. "Were you just yanking on my arm for fun back on the Orion?" "Damn it, I'm a cop, not a doctor," Donald grunted, equal parts annoyed and apologetic. "Just," Usher hissed and pointed a finger on his good left hand urgently at the useless right shoulder. "Stand still," he muttered as he lifted and isolated Usher's limp right arm, pressing one hand over Usher's collarbone and wrapped the other around the meat of his shoulder. "Ready to try this again?" Usher shook his head, but growled, "Yes, I'm goddamn." Surprising him, Donald wrenched his arm forward without warning just as he dug his thumb under his collarbone and pulled up. With a sickening crunch, the head of the humerus bone at the top of Usher's arm slid under the shoulder blade and back into its socket. The man's entire body clenched. He lifted up on his tiptoes. And then he sighed in relief as the intense pain on his right side became merely almost unbearable. "Thank you," Usher said as he relaxed. "Thank you, Inspector," Donald replied, and didn't know what else to say. He hoped his face showed how deeply he meant it. "You're sure about this? This is going to cost you." Usher waved the honorific away. "Not sure I won't get stripped down to beat cop after this. Call me Nick, if you'll call me Donald. Too formal, how about Don? Donnie?" Tyson's brain couldn't handle the question, and he started to giggle. "Fine, Donald, whatever," Nick smiled weakly. "Repercussions I can handle. Sending you back now, I might as well buy you a body bag now to take with." The smile faded the rest of the way. "Are you sure?" "Pretty sure that the guard isn't going to forgive and forget when a soldier goes AWOL." Donald sighed. His sad eyes met Nick's. "What I know now, that the system guard trains and arms terrorists, all to drive independent states, resisting guard protection, to beg us, to beg the guard, to come and save them. That I can't ever forget or forgive." Beyond the pain, his spirit felt numb. The guard had taken him and Sala in, given them a home, given them meaning. Now he was adrift again, without even his brother as an ally. "Where will you go?" Nick asked, then raised a hand before he could answer. "Don't answer that. Just get in touch through the roadhouse when you can. I'm pretty sure you'll find a way." Donald nodded, then shrugged. Farlost is a big place. No matter how the guard tries, there are lots of places where its satellites have been hacked or holed, and there are no friendly boots on the ground. He laughed bitterly. "Friendly boots," he repeated, his lips curled in a sneer that was meant for himself, for his own naive belief in the guard. The two men limped down a long catwalk into another docking bay. Donald stared through the cavernous space. It looked like any other cargo warehouse to him. Luckily, there were no personnel on the dock. Nick had guessed it would take time for the duty officers to respond to a surprise docking, given he was a cop with the correct sentry codes to access the facility. Only one airlock was lit ahead. The holographic display on the wall read, "Willer." Nick gave a two-tone whistle and the airlock slid open. A tile ramp clicked and clacked obediently out onto the floor. Donald stared at the ramp. "Your father's ship? Sure there's nothing else around here you'd rather I borrow?" Nick laughed, then hissed and sagged against a crate pushed up against the wall next to the airlock. "Willer's got a history, and some hidden talents you might need. Plus, I own this one. Means they can't come up with a clean reason to shoot you out of the sky, assuming they're desperate enough to try. Just take care of her. It's a loan, not a gift." He held up a hand and shouted into the open airlock. "Willer, I'm giving the keys to the guy who's about to board you. Full access to systems and data. You down with that?" "Authority request acknowledged," came a voice sounding much like Nick's, but deeper, tinged with age. Donald quirked an eyebrow and guessed. "Your father's voice." Nick nodded fractionally and groaned, then stopped. The two men stood awkwardly. "Not sure about protocol," Nick joked weakly. "Do we hug or—" Donald laughed and offered his hand. "We'll talk again. I'll make that happen. I owe you more than— Thank you for helping me end it with Bird, Nick, and for opening my eyes." A flash of memory hit Donald. An image of Sala leaning drunkenly over the top bunk of some ship on one of their vacation voyages, and the emptiness in his gut hit him hard. "Let's do this again sometime." Nick chuckled along with Donald, then shook his head. "Never thought I'd be doing this," he said, gazing down at the hand. He took it without competition and clasped it warmly. "Be seeing you, Donald." "I'll send word to Ada," he promised again, "and let you know how you can get Willer back." "Sure as hell better," Nick growled. Then his face softened back into a gentle smile. The handshake came to an end when they both realized it was still going on. It seemed far too long, and at the same time far too short a gesture after surviving the last few days together. Nick clapped Tyson's shoulder. "Better go before someone has the good sense to lock Willer down." "Oh." Donald reached for a sack hanging from his belt and passed it to Nick. His eyes crinkled fondly. "Take care of yourself." Hearing those words, Nick realized how much he'd missed the pain in the ass guard doggy. "You too," he mock glared, taking the bag. "Thanks for this. And take care of Willer." "I will," Donald promised solemnly, "and try to watch out for Jane." Tyson finally asked that awkwardly, just before turning, without waiting for an answer, to half-limp, half-jog up the tile ramp. Nick watched the tiles slide over each other, retracting inside the open airlock to pack themselves against Willer's side for launch. "I'll try," he promised softly to the empty room, over the building whine of Willer's engine. The pier side airlock closed and the whine faded. Nick tucked himself against the crate and eased himself down, trying to ignore the screaming hurts across his body. He felt Willer's vibration build through the wall, then disappear as Tyson piloted his family's ship away. He closed his eyes and waited. "Usher!" screamed Commissioner Grainer sometime later. Usher opened one eye and saw 4 black guard uniforms and 4 blue Locklaw uniforms approach him. They were led by a man in an unmarked black uniform and a short, red-haired woman in a severe page cut and Locklaw PD dress uniform. "Commissioner Grainer," he acknowledged with a gentle nod of his head. "Forgive me for not getting up." He focused on the man standing beside her, Consul Gomersall himself. "Where is Bird?" Grainer demanded. "He's gone. Gone splat on Casty's surface," Usher said and winked at Gomersall, "assuming the winds aren't still playing chew-toy with him." "What?" "This is an international incident, Inspector. That was a system guard prisoner and you were responsible for him. Tell me everything and you'd better be able to substantiate." "And where, pray tell?" Gomersall asked with a casual indifference Nick could see right through. "Is Liaison Officer Tyson?" Nick swooped his hand through the air and made jet sounds with his mouth. "I lent him my ride." He looked at the consul again. "He didn't feel like sticking around to talk to you." "Get your ass up, Inspector," Commissioner Grainer shrieked. "I want answers right now." Nick looked around the airlock. With Willer here, he'd slept on board more often than not since his dad had passed. He'd thought of this as home for years. He realized in his bones those days were over, and climbed to his feet with a sigh. "Don't worry, sir," he grunted. "Ship security cams cut the entire encounter, including Bird's final statements." Both the commissioner and the consul's eyes locked on him. Nick's smile hurt, but he enjoyed it. Something about the system guard recruiting and training him for terrorism, picking his targets for him before he decided he liked killing the guard's own soldiers more. Grainer turned to yell at the closest of his 4 Locklaw officers. "Secure Orion now! I want those records downloaded and wiped immediately." "Little late," Usher interrupted. I sent them on to the PD evidence server before we docked. He smiled even more broadly, not caring at all about the pain. Oh, I may have accidentally forwarded a copy to a couple of reporter friends, too. Sorry. Nick turned to Gomersall, his lips curling in disgust. I suspect you'll be hearing from those same reporters very soon. Feeling a sudden gust of rage lend him the strength, he stepped to within inches of Gomersall. All four of the black-clad soldiers shouted as one, drawing sidearms and aiming them at Nick's chest. He ignored them, leaning in and smiling. He enjoyed how tight the speechless consul's flat-lined lips stretched. No one will believe the ramblings of a terrorist, Gomersall replied mildly. Nick grinned. Better hope not, huh? He turned and walked away. Be seeing you, Usher, Gomersall promised with undisguised venom. Looking forward to it, Nick said without turning around. The commissioner ran after him, barking like a half-pound canine. You've broken 6 kinds of laws today, Mr. Usher. You're gone, you hear me? You're badgeless, finished. Nick ignored the tiny woman and kept walking. He lost his badge? Fine. But he was sure as hell not finished. Usher limped up the stairs to the roadhouse's 3rd floor. Spillane was there, putting out chairs. Jacoby sat at the bar, spinning the little vial of pond tears Ada had given him in a circle on the polished bar top. Newbie journalist Emily Tannis was ranting on a window display, talking to the audience, but unable to tear her eyes from the video of Roland Bird torturing the crewmen on Orion's bridge. Guard dogs thought they could just point me and shoot and I'd kill whoever they told me to, Bird's recorded image brayed. All for the glory of the Guard. Is this the true face of the Guard? Emily leaped right through the hologram, her beauty pageant features set with surprising steel. Locklaw, we are owed answers. She jabbed her finger at the viewer, her voice dropping lower, getting meaner. This reporter promises you will get those answers. Nick was impressed. He wouldn't have thought the cheerleader reporter had it in her. Screen mute, Spillane shouted when he caught sight of Nick, a chair in each his left and right upper and middle arms. We don't usually let cops in here. He nodded at the now silent gesticulations of Emily Tannis on the window display. For getting that news out, I'll make one more exception. Not really an exception, Nick said with a shrug. I'm currently unemployed. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy, Jacoby laughed from the bar. I'll pay you to watch my ass for a while instead. Nick glared back, but saw only nervous approval on the shirtless Pondy's face. He eased up on the glare. Is this who I am now? He wondered. One of the guys against the cops? No. He remembered Sergeant Farley and his own green partner. Those were the good guys. The people who steer the cops, at least some of them, were not. He'd figure the rest out later, after he slept for a month. He nodded his head, accepting Jacoby's words in the spirit they were offered. You're gonna pay 'em with what? Tear gossip? Spillane lifted 2 more chairs from a tabletop in one go and set them on a freshly mopped floor, tucking them neatly in place with practiced ease. You need a job, I'll put you on the door. He let loose a deep, evil chuckle. The regulars will drop a deuce when they see you out front. Job talk can wait, Nick said, leaning against the bar and easing onto a stool a couple of spots away from Jacoby. Could use a room, though. Spillane grunted and returned to setting the chairs back down on the spick-and-span polished floor. Ada will set you up when he gets back. Pretty sure you're always going to have a room here. Really? Because of history with that sweet, sweet host of his? Jacoby asked from the bar. Usher stared again at the Pondy, who shut up and went back to spinning the vial Ada had given him. Sorry, Spillane said, shrugging all 4 of his shoulders. I was catching the meat sack up on Roadhouse business and your name came up. Until I told him to stop, 'cause I don't need and I don't want to know any more than I have to about Roadhouse business, Jacoby shouted over the Skanen indignantly. Spillane just shrugged and set out more chairs. Jane's pretty little legs are gonna walk Ada home any time now, and I'm gonna hand this vial right back, Jacoby predicted, staring longingly at the bottle stacked behind the bar. Then I'm gonna hightail it back between Conchita's pretty little legs. We're gonna play house for the next month, and I'm gonna forget all about you fools. Right, Spillane said. His voice was packed with concern, and it set Nick on edge. The mouthy Pondy didn't quit back either. Instead, he stood up, pocketed the vial of Ada's memories, and sauntered over to the other side of the room, lifting chairs off the tabletops and setting them underneath. "Might as well keep busy until Legs gets back," he mumbled. "Don't let Ada or Jane hear you call them that," Spillane snorted, and Nick heard none of the usual disgust he'd kept in reserve for Jacoby. There was comfort in the words the two shared, and the same concern for the object of their discussion. "Where are you, Jane?" Nick wondered, with the revelations about the guard hitting the data streams. The very day Haven SG had been recognized by Locklaw, things were about to get nasty. Nick feared Locklaw was about to become a very different place, and like his father before him in other turbulent times, he was very glad the Roadhouse was around to help keep the peace. They hadn't asked him about Tyson or Bird's fate, just accepted him into the waiting around for Ada club. Nick was grateful for that acceptance. It surprised him, but it went a long way to fill up the recently emptied places inside him. He stood with a groan and helped Spillane and Jacoby with the chairs, hoping again Ada would return soon. And Jane, he thought, fists tightening around the ornately scrolled posts of the back of a chair. "Get your ass back here, Jane." Inside his opulent new residence, inside the new office he hadn't yet purged of its decadent artwork and ludicrously stocked bar, Consul Gomersall ignored all of that and turned in place, staring at the light field floating all around him. He didn't quite grasp what he was seeing. Intellectually, oh yes, he understood, but it didn't seem quite real. Farlost was a harsh realm, but this was almost too cruel a joke for even this rotting corner of the universe. "Years," he whispered. He'd planned every stage of his arrival here in Locklaw meticulously. He knew exactly what would follow, and the corruption he'd hoped existed in this sky city was even more widespread than he dared dream. Cree, Underwood, the gangs preying on the proudly free citizens, of which the police were one. "Wait," he snarled, staring at the heavy black letters hanging in the air, taunting him with their directives. "Do not activate the sleeper agents the guard had placed in Locklaw so long ago. Hold off on the carefully planned terror campaign crafted for Roland Bird's special talents. Cultivate the relationship with Cree, but make no promises at this time. Take no action. Wait for further instructions." The heavily encrypted tight-beam video file reached its end, and without pause picked up from the beginning. Gomersall shook his head, ignoring the impossible images playing out around him. He had stood there for hours, watched the scene unfold more times than he could count. He watched again. Sped up 1,000 times, a perfectly smooth, totally black sphere rose into space, edging past the glittering bands of broken ships, centuries in the making, that had not escaped the grasp of the spiky planetoid below. A sickly yellow, spotted through with lifeless grays, covered with impossibly tall peaks, like some spiky pollen exploded from the microscopic to God-sized. A thorn. One of the spiky monstrous shapes orbited next to every high-gravity mass in the system. God's spite made manifest, some said. Others called them the instruments of the hypothetical captors, which had yanked every craft effort to attempt faster-than-light transit. Still others believed the thorns to be the universe's immune system, nothing sentient or supernatural about them. Whatever the reason, the thorns were the locus of arrival for every ship damned to Farlost within moments after beginning their attempts to cheat the laws of the universe. The vast majority of ships to arrive, once every few centuries, fell immediately into the oversized gravity wells of the thorns. A few of them would orbit for a few centuries or more, flaring brightly like lighthouses of old and warning away anyone unlucky or stupid enough to risk approach. The rest would sink until they reached the shatter zone, the place where the laws of physics broke down, the place where the thorn began to devour the dead or the dying. A craft well known to all guard intelligence officers rose alongside the Black Egg. The Betty McKenna, an independent trading craft the guard listed as dangerous and branded as pirates. In reality, nothing but pitiful scavengers, but scavengers which traded with nation-states and fleets with interests counter to the Guard, hence their branding as pirates. The Betty was a human design held together by, frankly, brilliant engineering and more than a little luck. Dragon scale dotted the nose of the human Neo-shuttle design, and alien retrofittings ran throughout her bones. The ingenious work allowed its crew to survive year after year when the Guard had managed to destroy or annex many of her ilk. Each year her crew orbited closer to their inevitable fate. Swear an oath to the Guard, submit to inspections, pay the tax, and accept a bomb in the belly of your ship to keep you loyal and keep you flying. The Betty McKenna had avoided that fate for many a year by engaging in stupidly dangerous enterprises to eke out enough profit to feed its engines and its crew. The most dangerous of which involved, literally and figuratively, orbiting the only other fate open to her crew, fishing salvage out of the wash of a Thorn's gravity well. Halfway through the footage, speeding past at 1,000 times the speed of the actual events recorded, it looked as if the Betty had finally risked too much and sealed its fate. Gomersall winced against the flare of light when the black egg appeared. The shock wave of its arrival had smashed through the Betty and a hulk it had attached itself to, and both the hulk and the Betty, its engines damaged, had begun the long sink down into the Thorn's impossibly high gravity, bound for the shatter zone far below. Gomersall closed his eyes, not wanting to watch the impossible take place yet again. The impossible events which had saved Lochlaw's Sky City, at least for the moment. Still, it was wondrous and surprising, and his curiosity was soon again piqued, and he opened his eyes to marvel at the strangeness of this new arrival. The Guard would bring order to Lochlaw, just as it would to all of Farlost. Civilization would be saved from the depredations of trillions of panicked sentients, stuck far from home, far from rule of law, far from sanity. Only the Guard could save Farlost. Its founder, Admiral Hallis Robeson, had defeated the dragons and would one day gather all the sentients under the Sun Medallion and protect them from themselves. Then the minds, talents, and resources of all of Farlost could be turned toward understanding what had brought them here and how, finally, to escape. It was as inevitable as the Betty McKenna's damaged body falling now into the Thorn, as inevitable as its atomic structure slowly fizzing away in the shatter zone so far below. No, Gomersall scowled. That was the wrong analogy, since for the first time in recorded history something existed which escaped the inescapable fate of a Thorn's embrace. Gomersall watched again as the egg disappeared, revealing a long needle. In actuality, a human ship construction, but primitive, anarchistic. A stack of cylindrical fuel tanks atop stack of cylindrical fuel tanks atop a blocky drive section. Pitiful, really. Had humanity taken a step back in the last 70 or so years, Gomersall wondered? Gomersall also fumed, doubting the truth of that thought as he watched the simple ship race quickly forward on an intersect course with the damaged Betty McKenna. Together, the new arrival and the scavengers righted their course and rose away from the Thorn. All his plans, more than a decade of groundwork, contacts, bribery, and assassinations, all to get him standing here in Lochlaw, embraced by the people without a shot fired, all frozen in amber, thanks to the impossibilities stacked upon impossibilities in the image surrounding him. An arrival was a once-in-a-lifetime event. For one to fall square in the midst of the culmination of his life's work? Impossible. The Betty McKenna was a popular ship among the Free States, but ships didn't fly on love, especially when the Guard did everything it could to poison the trust such dangerous entities enjoyed among the uneducated and unwashed. For a free flyer to so publicly be saved from a Thorn? Impossible. And dangerous. Gomersall waved his hand, and time reversed itself again. He dropped his hand, allowing time to return to its natural course, once the black egg winked back into existence around the pitiful stack of technological twigs that was the new arrival. Hascom Heliocentric Lab 6, or HHL-6 according to its hull markings, had arrived from its faster-than-light journey inside the crushing depths of gravity, very near the base of the Thorn. It had arrived from FTL inside the shatter zone itself. Its pre-arrival velocity had pointed it up and away, but that shouldn't have mattered. The black egg that surrounded it had no mass. Its makeup was unknown to guard science, resembling the mythical force fields of ancient mass media and myth. An energy field that could withstand the atom-smashing furnace of a Thorn? Yet another impossibility. One the guard ached, raged to possess. All campaigns, be they military or unofficial black ops, like Gomersal's Locklaw initiative, all actions were on hold, all resources turned towards the recovery of a newly arrived technology heretofore unknown in all of Farlost, one that threatened to turn the tide of the Guard's war to unite the system, one that in the wrong hands could destroy the Guard itself. Gomersal imagined an army of black eggs descending on the Guard fleet. What hope could it have to repel the attack of an enemy immune to the horrors in the bellies of the Thorns themselves? Gomersal's stomach quivered with fear. He waved the images away and stood in the dark. At the very moment his life's work was being realized, Farlost had once again defeated the hopes of those it imprisoned. Wait for further instructions, he spat again, and emptied the bottle he held into his mouth, swallowing the last drops, and hoping they would be enough to numb him. There was a rap on the door. Moments later, it whipped open as Penny swung her wings and yanked it wide. "Nick," she called before her eyes adjusted to the gloom in the hall. The lights from her window and the hollow her children were swooping around, excitedly talking over each other about, spilled past her. There was no one in the hall. Jarvie's incredulous, excited voice, still giving some comfort to Penny as she grieved for Pesh, poured into the hall with the light. "Momentous day like no other in this reporter's life. I repeat, for viewers just now joining us live, today is an arrival day. Despite System Guard interference, independent confirmation from Erie and Martel network satellites, as well as verification from ships near the scene, confirm the arrival." Penny swooped into the doorway, peering down the hall in either direction. She reached her tails to grab the corner of the door when she spotted the small white bag on the floor. Her tails snagged it and brought it to her mouth graspers. Inside were bloodless human fingers. Penny knew whose they were without reading the name Nick had scrawled on the bag. Her mouth graspers shook, her lips pulling back in the manta equivalent of a trembling smile. "Thank you, Nick." "Light the kitchen fire, kids," she shrieked, even more high-pitched than her brood, still transfixed by the hollow of a Thorn salvage craft, a strange new arrival, and an ancient silver ship, all hurtling away from what was supposed to have been their unshakable fate. You have been listening to The Rundown, a Farlost story, written by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Opening music, Everything Is Not What It Appears, kindly provided by Nate Maingard at natemaingard.com. Closing music, Full On, by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. If you like what you hear, you can become a patron and support more stories at patreon.com/servingworlds. Thanks for listening. See you next week.